All right, hello and welcome to the course. We're starting at the beginning with polytheism. Uh, Most of the earliest recorded religions we have are all polytheistic. So we'll take a little tour of some of these. So when we say polytheistic, poly meaning many, theistic meaning gods, right? They reflect a belief in a multiplicity of gods. Uh, the earliest religious texts we have are from ancient Sumeria. This was a civilization in the Middle East around modern day Iraq in the 4000s BC. Uh, and they had tablets written in what we call cuneiform. You'll see a photo of one later on. They're little kind of, they would write in clay with a stylus, and it would create a little sort of wedge shape, and different arrangements of these wedge shapes were their form of writing. After Sumeria, that same area in modern day Iraq was dominated by a series of great empires, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians. And much of the religion was actually continuous over the course of thousands of years sometimes. The Babylonians would pick up a lot of the Sumerian mythology. That's one of the things about polytheism, is it's pretty open-ended, right? If you believe in lots of gods, then you can pick up new ones. It's not a great change to your theology. And um, often we found later civilizations retaining the gods of earlier civilizations and adding on some new ones from some new civilizations that they encountered. Now, we're starting there because that's when we have written history, right? So where history begins is when humans start writing things down. There is some evidence that we interpret as religion from earlier. Um, so these little figures like this, the Venus of Willendorf, uh, scholars think, were evidence of a sort of Earth Mother religion that is even older than 4000 BC. There's even we call bear shrines that may date even to sort of Neanderthals, right? So even like different species than humans. Right? Humans are Cro-Magnons. We're talking about cavemen, right? Two species of cavemen, and they kind of intermixed a bit. But there are Neanderthal sites where it looks like they would take a bear skull and it would be a sort of a religious object. If you think about it, right? If you're a human at that time, bears were in many ways superior to you, right? You didn't have a shotgun, and so a bear would be pretty impressive. They're bigger and they're stronger, and so we can imagine, bears being the object of religious worship as well. So, but we don't, all we have is archaeological evidence again. Until the Sumerians here, we don't have any written evidence, and so we're going to start. We're not really going to dig too deeply into the archaeology and start with the historical religion. The first thing to sort of wrap your head around what religion was like in this time is to remember that, this is 6,000 years ago. There wasn't a distinction between religion and science and history and myth. It was all balled together, right? So the stories that people told of the origin of their people, involved gods fighting with monsters and fighting with humans. And if you ask them, hey, is this literally true, right? Or is this just a story? It's not even clear they would understand the question you were asking. It's only a more recent invention, really, that we get into skepticism, where we think, well, this part that is in the Bible might be true, but the other part might not, and so on. So back then, we just didn't. It was all sort of mashed together in the same sort of ball of like the story of our people. So we didn't have at the time, again, 6,000 years ago, a scientific explanation of why, day and night happen in succession and why rain falls and crops grow. But people were acutely interested in making their crops grow. And so they wanted to understand how these things worked. And mythology and intercourse with gods, right? Speaking with gods and sacrificing to gods and trying to get favors from gods was the way how they understood these sort of invisible forces that seemed to govern uh, their universe. And there wasn't really any sort of incoherence in the idea that maybe the founder of your city was a god, right? So you might say, oh, yeah, we don't remember, when Los Angeles was founded. It was, generations and generations ago. But, the story we're told is that it was Angelo, right? They're often what we call eponymous, right? So the god would have the same name as the city that they founded and things like that. And that would have been history, the story of their gods, and how, again, how rain happened and things like that. That was how they understood things. So, we call it religion. At the time, that was the cutting edge explanation of the universe. They were looking for explanations. You have to start somewhere. You might think that we've improved since then. Um, but, what we've lost is, in our science, is any account of, where you and I fit into the overall scheme of the universe and any sort of guidance for a way to live. That is sort of splintered off into ethics classes and things like that. At the time, it was a really sort of unified account of social life, religious life, practical work life, and things like that. So as I said, if you imagine yourself 6,000 years ago, you knew that things happened that were governed in some way by unseen forces. So, you knew that when you drop things, they move towards the ground, right? You knew that sometimes it rained, sometimes it didn't. Um, you knew that women got pregnant. You weren't probably entirely sure how that happened, right? And so there were unexplained things or forces, regularities, we could say, that didn't have obvious causes. Um, and so ancient people would characterize these forces in various abstract ways. Sometimes they called it mana, spiritual energy. Um, but early on, right, this tendency to make these abstract forces was a little bit later development, as we'll see. Early on, it was very anthropomorphic, uh, or, meaning that these forces were taken to be beings of some sort, right? And sorts of beings that you could maybe draw in clay or describe to each other. They might have some animal-like aspects or human-like aspects. But most importantly, they were uh, posited to have basically sort of a human psychology, meaning that, well, the gods wanted certain things, right? And they were happy to, enter into exchanges with us to give us what we want if they get what they want. And this is, basic human belief, desire psychology. And they figured the gods had that too, right? So, and the psychology of the gods, then you can harness that, use it to your advantage. You can get some rain for your crops. So, oh, I think I spelled a numeral here. I miss tendency. Kant talks about the numeral too, but so sorry. So Rudolf Otto, he was a German religious thinker from like the early 1900s. So this realm of the spiritual, he wrote this book called The Idea of the Holy, right? Um, and this is a popular tendency. I don't know if maybe some of you have read like Joseph Campbell, or there are writers and thinkers who want to sort of unify the religious experience across all times and all peoples. And Otto was doing a bit of that too. Uh, whether that's correct or useful is another question. Uh, but he posited that this belief in, experience of, or attempt to interact with a spiritual realm, right, a non-physical realm that is sort of behind the physical, uh, central to all religious experience. Importantly, this realm for Otto was not something that you could discover through science or through reason. Uh, the only way to get in touch with the noumenal realm was through experience. Right? There are different ways to have that experience. Sometimes, as we'll see, like with yoga and with Buddhism, there's meditative practices that are designed to get you to have some sort of spiritual experience. Other times, more often in Christianity, it sort of comes on you in a great wash without you even expecting it. Um, it can be experienced in different ways, a sort of quiet, calm experience of God, bacchanalian revelry. Bacchus was a Greek god of wine and sex, basically, right? So some people, some cultures had religious experiences by partying, basically. That's what bacchanalian revelry is. Um, Sometimes a sort of a fearful experience of terror, right? Out of the nature of the spiritual. So Otto's found this, recognized this in all different cultures, and seemed to think that even polytheistic cultures were trying to get into the noumenal. We saw that earlier, that little statue, the Venus of Willendorf. This is taken to be evidence of earlier prehistoric female fertility goddess religions. Um, this makes sense. Women have children. That's pretty astonishing. And particularly if you don't know, even if you do know the science, it's astonishing. And then particularly if you don't, you know, quite understand how it happens, that's going to seem like a powerful uh, thing. And so goddesses, it is posited, right? Again, this is lost history, right? But many people think goddesses were like the main uh, deities for a long time until the historical period. Uh, and then you had a male goddess of the sky, and they would kind of meet. Right? And through their union, you would get all the fruits and the flowers and the trees and things like that. So these fertility goddesses persisted, even if ultimately the men sort of took over religion, as we'll see. But they never went away. So Inanna and Sumeria, Ishtar and Babylon, Anat and Canaan, Isis in Egypt, Aphrodite in Greece. They're all versions of the same sort of female fertility. Um, you might argue that the Virgin Mary plays a similar role in Catholicism. Right? This female energy. So here I spell noumenal correctly. Um, the thing about the noumenal world, right, is that it is not just this shadowy realm that we don't understand very well, but it's important, in many ways more important than the visible world, more real, right? Uh, which in a way makes sense. So human life, very fleeting, right? People are born and they die. Uh, crops grow and they go away. Sometimes you get lucky, sometimes you don't. But particularly back in these days when you had very little control over chance and people did not live very long and often got ill and died, human condition could seem pretty precarious, and another world that was more permanent was attractive, right? So the noumenal realm, this realm of the spiritual, sort of considered this atemporal, beyond time, right, immortal realm um, that emanated, which is mean to sort of like create all the earthly things, and then when all the earthly things died, they went back to the noumenal realm. Uh, and this is sort of a perfect kind of realm that makes up for the inadequacies of our own human. Taken together, this is a unified reality. And often it was posited that every person or animal or object in our world had a noumenal counterpart, right? So there would be a, um, spiritual Nate in addition to the corporeal or bodily Nate. So we don't have a lot from the Sumerians. We have more from the Babylonians, and they preserve a lot of the earlier Sumerian religion. The Akkadians, the Assyrians, these are all successive empires that occupied the same area. Um, but in polytheism, gods are largely local, right? So if you're from, say, Whittier, right, and you worship your Whittier god, if you go to uh, Beverly Hills, well, then you worship the Beverly Hills god in Beverly Hills. And even if you come from Whittier and conquer Beverly Hills, you don't stop believing in the Beverly Hills god, right? You would incorporate them into your mythology. And so this is the case, even if outside peoples came in and conquered the Sumerians, they wouldn't destroy all their gods or think that they were exist or were worthless, they would incorporate those into their religion because they governed a locality. Um, so the Babylonians, some of what we know of their religion, they had a king, uh, but it was assumed that the king ruled at the pleasure of the gods. And this is ancient and persisted well into the not the modern age, but well into the, I don't know, Middle Ages. That a king, a ruler, was appointed by God. They were chosen by God, and this was the case for the Babylonians as well. And every year they would have a New Year festival, and they would uh, sacrifice animals. Animal sacrifice was common. The king was sort of symbolically in sort of a play deposed from the throne and sort of ridiculed and then restored to his throne. And so this was the Babylonian New Year festival that persisted for a long time. The basic sort of creation myth of the Babylonians um, is a slow process of the relatively orderly world we see today uh, being formed from a primordial in the beginning for the Babylonians. And this story is sort of, as we'll see, imported into the Bible a bit by later editors. It doesn't seem to appear in the earliest versions of the Bible that we but in the beginning, there's just soup, right? And then you have some sort of division where you have to battle a soup monster in order to kill it, and then out of its body, right, create some parts that are slightly more recognizable as the our universe, right? There might, you kill the monster, and then part of it becomes the mountains, and part of it becomes and so on. And there are successive battles and bits of the earlier gods gradually create a more stable. Um, but there's constant fear of this chaos emerging, right? And so part of these regular rituals, sacrifices, is to keep chaos at bay and keep nature and the world orderly. So the Enuma Elish describes this series of battles that begins with chaos and ends with a world that more or less resembles our own. Um, the gods become increasingly less abstract and more anthropomorphic, more human-like. Well, so we begin with the formless, watery soup. Um, Maybe not a coincidence that these religions originated in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, right? So the Tigris and Euphrates are two major rivers that empty into the Persian Sea, run through what is now Iraq. Back then, it was a bit more fertile, right? The climate changed in the intervening 6,000 years. So it was very fertile but swampy, right? Needed to be drained, and the water needed to be managed in order for it to be farmed. And so these stories may record in some way that process of taming the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. So you have Apsu, the god of freshwater rivers, Tiamat, the god of the salty sea, and Mummu, god of chaos. These are the first gods. Um, but just having them around is not a huge improvement on the more chaotic, watery soup. Now you've got fresh and salty water that helps. But in order to sort of get the world into the shape that it is in now, there's further gods, right, that fought the older gods, and culminating in the sun god Marduk, who killed Tiamat in a battle. Marduk created our current world from the dead body of Tiamat, and then he created humanity from dust, sounding familiar, right? Like Genesis, um, and the body of another dead god who was kind of a comical god, right? So it kind of emphasizes the sort of even though we're in part divine, right, made from the body of a god, we're also in part made from a sort of imperfect and somewhat comical. So the Babylonians built these ziggurats, these tall towers, and that was where the worship of Marduk, sort of in between earth and heaven sort of space, where you know, physically be closer to God. So there are similar stories in other religions. If you're familiar with Greek mythology, you also see primordial sky and earth gods and battles among the gods, Titans, right, and then the Olympian gods. Um, Zeus eventually murders the Titans, and Zeus becomes the sky god and becomes the main god, just like Marduk is for the Babylonians. Um, but we get Babylonian mythology most directly because it was very influential in an area known as Canaan, right, which became the home of the Israelites. Um, so Baal Habad was a god of storm and fertility, um, and Baal battled with the god of water, Yam Nahar, and Baal's father was El, who is the highest god. So if you're familiar with the Bible, some of these names come back to it. When I was a kid, they pronounced it Baal, um, in, but that was one of the bad, uh, pagan gods that they were constantly slipping back into worshiping in the Old Testament. Elohim, right, was one of the names for God, for the true God in the Bible. And so it's not a coincidence, right? This is the local religion that filtered into the Bible. So Baal dies, goes to the underworld, and his lover, who is also his sister, uh, pursues him into the underworld, defeats the god of the underworld, and then Baal is brought back to life. Uh, this story of a god that goes and dies and then is rescued from the underworld gets repeated over and over. It may be familiar to you in Greek mythology, in Egyptian mythology, Isis and Osiris, right? In Greek mythology, Persephone, um, and then Jesus also dies, right, and comes back. So these stories, right? These myths persist. Uh, One devotee of this Canaanite religion was Abraham, right? Who was the father of the Jewish faith and the Christian and the Muslim faith. So he's a character. Now, at this stage in history, it's really hard to say, uh, was there a person named Abraham? We don't really have the tools to be able to answer that. The only evidence for Abraham is out of the Bible. Um, and so if the Bible is accurate, then sure, but how do we know the Bible is accurate? There's not much. When we get to Jesus, we'll find, that's more firmly planted in the historical era, and we can have more sensible arguments about it. But when it comes to and these characters, we're just going to accept, sort of speak of them as if they are real people that existed. Um, Often, what was the case was they were, what we called eponymous ancestors. Like I said, like if there was an Angelo that was the founder of Los Angeles, often various tribes had eponymous ancestors. That may be what Abraham is. We don't know for sure. Right? But he lived in the Sumerian city of Ur, according to the story, and then around 1900 BC moved to Canaan. Abraham may have been a merchant, like a nomadic merchant. Maybe he could have been a mercenary soldier. Um, Again, he could have been an eponymous ancestor. That is, like, just someone who's sort of invented as the giving the name to a certain tribe. Um, we do have the story of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? The son and then his grandson. Um, those may be sort of representing mythologically different waves of Hebrew settlement into Canaan, of other sorts of nomadic merchant types like Abraham, who were finding Canaan to be a nice place to settle. So in the story of the Bible, Jacob has, Jacob, Abraham's grandson, has 12 sons, and they all go to Egypt when there's a famine in Canaan, and they come to represent the 12 tribes of Israel. Uh, Then we have the Israelites coming back to Canaan from Egypt. This is the story of Moses, right, of the plagues and of the parting of the Red Sea and all that. I understand I'm moving very quickly through a huge chunk of Old Testament history. Um, this is a survey course. We're talking about a lot of different religions, and so can't get into great deal of any one of them, right? But this is gets us up to to Moses, and by the time we get to Moses, um, as we'll see, we will get into more detail about the nature of their God. Um, when it's Abraham, he's very closely related to the Canaanite religion. He's talking about Elohim, right? When we get to Moses, we're talking about Yahweh. Are they the same? I mean, ultimately, they are united in biblical history. Were they originally the same God, or were they two distinct gods that were sort of joined together later in when people were working out the theology? That's an open question. Of course, everything that the Bible says about this period of 1800 BC was written much later. I mean, some of the earliest Bible stuff could have been written in the 700s BC. Of course, we don't have any of that actual text. What we have is going to be it's typically stuff from like the 1300s, like 1000 AD. We have copies of copies of copies. Remember, all this is written by hand. They didn't have printing presses or Xerox machines. So, doing the history of religion is a difficult thing because we're looking, as Paul says, backwards through a glass darkly. So we have to make a lot of educated guesses. Right? But so the guess is that all this story of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob through Moses was written up in the 700s BC, but maybe they had earlier traditions or earlier sources that they were drawing on. So let's get into that, the sort of biblical scholarship and how that works. So scholars have argued that there are four distinct sources that they can identify. So they can typically often identify a certain writer's style, right? For example, the name they use for God, right, and things like that. And they do this with the New Testament as well. They can sort of pick apart and say, we think that the Old Testament we have is a combination of sort of four different versions, right? There was one called J and one called E, and those are the earliest ones. Now, those get their names because the J version, right, that they kind of like have pulled out, they read the Old Testament, and they say, well, I think these passages were probably originally in the J version. These ones were probably originally in the E. We don't have a copy of J or E, right? So this is partially guesswork, but educated guesswork. So it seems like somebody was writing this stuff down who referred to God as Yahweh. There was someone else writing this stuff down that referred to God as Elohim, and those two traditions got joined together at some point by a later editor. Right? So we also have two other sources, D, which is the author of Deuteronomy, right? So that's a later book. That person seemed to have done some editing as well of the earlier books. And then we have a later P, which is the priestly version. So this happened much later after the kingdom of Israel was no longer, it had been conquered by the Babylonians, and the Jews had been brought to Babylon to live in exile. And the Jewish priests there were working on compiling a version of the Bible and also did some editing of these sources. So, the Bible that we have is edited over thousands of years, right, by many different people, and scholars have tried to pull these apart. Now, in the text we have, Karen Armstrong speaks as though this is pretty much accepted. This has been the J and E thing has come into more question. People are wondering if there's maybe more work was actually done by. So take it with a grain of salt. This sort of scholarship is always developing, and it's they do a lot of work with very little evidence that they have to work with. Right? But still, it's very clever and well done. So let's talk about Yahweh for a minute. So the J author, first of all, J author doesn't really do the whole story of Genesis, the 7 days, any of that. Seems not very interested in a mythical account of the origins of the universe. No battles or dismemberment of gods. Just sort of very quickly says, yeah, God created the heavens and the earth, and He made humans from dust. The Genesis we have is in the P version, right? So that's from much later. and it represents. Remember, the P version was written in Babylon, and so it is very influenced by Babylonian mythology. So J really settles in to its own when it gets to the story of Abraham, who was, approached by Yahweh to create a religious and political community centered on him. And this sort of interaction is interesting because it's fairly personal, right? The Babylonians typically wouldn't sit down and have a conversation with Marduk, right? The Greeks, Zeus would intervene in human affairs, often disguised as like a swan or a golden cloud or something. But there is some kind of personal, emotional relationships that go on between various characters in the Bible and Yahweh that's sort of distinctive and interesting. P doesn't even bring Yahweh onto the scene at all until he appears to Moses in a burning bush. So you've got Yahweh and Elohim sort of mixed up in, frankly, very confusing ways in the. But the big picture that we can see, right, if you sort of zoom out, is that a lot of the Old Testament in the history of this early period with Abraham up through Moses and even into the kingdom of Israel is a struggle for monotheism, right? It's not that monotheism was adopted early and wholeheartedly by all Jews, by all Israelites. There's a constant tendency for the Israelites and even the kings, right, the Israelite kings, to sort of slide back into polytheism, right? You remember one of the most famous stories of that. Remember, Moses goes up, right, to get the Ten Commandments from God. He comes down ready to report to people, and he sees them worshiping idols, right, worshiping a golden calf, and he's so upset he throws down the Ten Commandments and breaks them. Right? We'll see over and over later on various prophets coming around and saying, you shouldn't be worshiping these idols, you shouldn't be worshiping these Canaanite gods. Yahweh is your only God. So El, right, or Elohim, when he appears in the Bible, as Abraham understood him, was probably synonymous with the chief god of the Canaanites. El, right, Israel includes the name El. El shows up in a lot of Jewish names to this day. But we see a lot of personal interaction with El, right? Sitting down with El and having chats, right? This is not like the Greek gods, or very much like the Babylonian gods. Yahweh, typically, when he shows up, is a little more scary, right? You've got burning bushes and other sort of more violent apparitions. So El seems to be fairly personable, and then Yahweh is a little bit more like a kind of a sky god or a warrior god. So these interactions with gods, when they happen, we call them epiphanies. And this was, not unknown in polytheistic societies to see a god. In Greek mythology, Zeus will rape human women, right? That's a kind of epiphany. It's a sort of horrific one. But gods would be involved in human, affairs. So they're not, but everyday occurrences, but they do happen, right? And there's a lot of these sorts of epiphanies in the Bible, but they tend to be I keep saying personable, but yeah, they tend to be sort of one-on-one, sort of like, well, later they get scary too, but the early versions are not quite so scary. Abraham serves a meal to God and to angels, right? That God comes by with two angels, and Abraham's, sits down and has a meal with them, right? Jacob, and the story of Jacob's ladder, right? He spends a night in a spot, and he dreams, or it happens, right, that a ladder reaches up to heaven, and he sees the angels coming up and down the ladder, right? That's where he decides that Yahweh is God, and he also wrestles with El later on. So very sort of like touchy-feely kind of interactions with God here. And God is not so much a moral force in these early stories he is just a powerful force, right? Some of the things God does early on in the Testament, Old Testament, sorry, um, if a person did them, we would say that person is evil, right? When it's God, we say, well, maybe the normal categories don't apply. So, the story of Abraham is well known, right? He tells Abraham. So Abraham had trouble conceiving, right? He and his wife, and they finally do. God says, "You're going to have a son, and you're going to have right. There's going to be a great race of nation of people that descends from you." And Abraham, it's like, come on, uh, we can't have kids. Well, eventually Isaac is born. It's a miracle. It's an amazing, right? Miracle. And then not long after, God says, "Hey, remember that son that was so hard for you to have? Uh, I would actually like you to sacrifice that son to me." And so Abraham does it. He almost goes through with it. God stops him at the last minute. But what is that, right? Is that a moral thing to do? Or God obviously seems to be testing or trying to make some point, but like, why? Is he punishing Abraham? What did Abraham do, right? When God rescues the Israelites from Egypt, right? He only does so after killing all the firstborn sons of the Egyptians. Now, some of the blame is supposed to go on the Pharaoh, right? He wouldn't release them until God killed all the Egyptian sons. Then he drowns the whole army in the Red Sea, right? But he does a lot of killing, right? This God, and it tends to be in favor of the Israelites, right? He's a partisan here. He's not the universal God of everyone. He's on the side of the Israelites, and they matter more to him than Egyptian babies. Now, there is a form of justice sneaking in there as well, right? That will probably develop over time. By siding with the Israelites, he's siding with the oppressed, right? The Israelites are always sort of having a hard time or in trouble. They're never like the great kings of Egypt. They're always the oppressed group. And so he is sort of on the side of the vulnerable in a way. And maybe that's beginnings of a notion of a just or righteous God. But early on, he just seems to primarily be a powerful and a partisan God. So, right, Yahweh hands Moses the Ten Commandments, and from the top of this mountain that is forbidden, deadly to touch, right? You're not supposed to climb or you will die, but Moses is able to climb it. That's apparently where Yahweh lives, right? Again, very sort of like anthropomorphic at this stage. And so we get a moral code, right? So there is a sense of morality. And it's sort of a novel sort of moral code in terms of world religion at the time. So often religions are trying to sort of like understand the natural order of things, and their mythology is explaining right and wrong in terms of what is natural, how the universe works, right? As we'll see, maybe Taoism being like the most extreme version of this. This is not what Yahweh is up to, right? Yahweh is making a list of commands, and he's saying, this is right and wrong because I say so, right? I'm not saying this is why, you should do these things if you want to be in tune with the universe or if you want to be prosperous. There's no if you want, blah, blah, blah. It's like, I'm telling you, this is it. I made it up. I decided murder is wrong. So this is a distinct ethical theory that is known as divine command theory. We'll see later we'll explore a writing by Plato who points out a kind of inherent tension in divine command theory. It's known as the Euthyphro dilemma because it's in uh, Euthyphro. But in a nutshell, right, the dilemma is this, right? So is that how it works? Is murder is wrong because God commands it's wrong. God is the source of morality. And in some sense, that's clean and right and not confusing, right? Clear cut. You know that you'll be punished, right? If you violate those, it's fairly straightforward. But the weirdness of it is if murder is only wrong because God commanded it, then God could have just as easily commanded murder to be right, and it's sort of arbitrary that he chose one rather than the other, right? Um, and because the command is the reason for the morality, right? There's no, that's the idea, is that there's no like more serious morality that God is just channeling. God is literally creating right and wrong off the cuff, and something about that seems very strange and arbitrary, right? That God just picked. Anyways, we'll talk a little more about that. So elsewhere in the Old Testament, Yahweh is described as making a covenant with Moses on Mount Sinai. So a covenant is just a deal, a contract, right? Uh, and the contract, the deal is stop worshiping all these other gods, just worship me, Yahweh, and in exchange, I'm going to look out for you, you Israelites. Uh, Interesting is that implicit in having to make that deal is that there are other gods out there, right? That the Israelites could be worshiping and maybe were worshiping, and God's trying to incentivize them to stop worshiping those gods and start worshiping Him, right? Um, so the background assumption here is not a monotheistic at all yet. It's a basically polytheistic world, and Yahweh is saying, "Hey, you and me, Israelites, go with me, and you picked a winner here. I'm your God." Right? Um, this is not the first attempt at monotheism. The Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten had tried this before. He decided when he became pharaoh that you could only worship Ra, the sun god, and worship all other gods was forbidden. It didn't really catch on. As soon as he died, the Egyptians went back to worshiping many gods. And as we'll see, that seems to be the tendency among the Israelites too. They repeatedly break the covenant. They're always worshiping other gods. And the prophets and other biblical authors are constantly blaming all the terrible things that happened to the Israelites on their constant breaking of the covenant. So the development of monotheism, at least of the God that we know today in Judaism and Christianity and Islam, is not a clean break, right? It's not a quick story or an easy story to tell. Seems to take thousands of years, and there's constant backsliding into polytheism. Uh, there's lots of similarities between the religion of Yahweh and the ancient Canaanite religion. So Solomon's temple has many of aspects of Canaanite temples of the time, right? They've got this big bronze basin that represented Yam, the primeval sea. They've got these pillars that tended to be associated with the fertility cult of Asherah. They still kept up with the animal sacrifices. Later prophets kept saying these animal sacrifices, Yahweh doesn't like them, but it's not clear early on. Yahweh seems to like them. Um, Kings and many people were marrying outside their religion, and so the king marries a pagan queen, then all of a sudden, she's going to want to keep worshiping her gods, and paganism starts to creep back into the dynasty. King Ahab marries Jezebel, maybe a familiar name. She was pagan. That's why she gets kind of a bad rap in the Bible. And she was trying to get Israel to go back to the cult of Baal, of the Canaanite god. That happened. The story of Elijah, who's sort of like competing with Baal, and he says, "My God Yahweh is the real God. Baal can't do anything," and he produced rain, right? So this was again the whole reason that that story exists is because it was not easy to just become monotheists. People seem to have trouble with it. So finally, to wrap up this part on the polytheism, we've gone already kind of long. So Elijah will use his story during the reign of Ahab, his interactions with Jezebel, as kind of the end of a epoch in the early story of Yahweh. So this temptation. So we've gone through, Abraham coming to Canaan, the Israelites going to Egypt, coming back, conquering some territory, right? Creating a kingdom, having kings, right? I've skipped over King David and King Solomon, right? Just because we don't have time to cover all of that. So we're into the period where Israel is a nation, right? But still, their religious situation is developing slowly, right? They are not a unified under Yahweh in any real sense, right? So, in the story of Elijah is sort of the end of that era, right? The temptation to worship foreign gods just won't go away, but monotheism is, getting stronger. And so after this incident with Jezebel, Elijah flees to safety, right? Again, she's still queen, right? He's worried for his life. And so Elijah, while he's in hiding, he experiences all these sort of natural disasters. There's a great fire, right? Great wind coming through. And he feels a great earthquake. And the scripture goes out of the way to say, God was not in the fire. God was not in the wind. God was not in the great earthquake. God is not an anthropomorphized natural force, right? Like the polytheistic religions. And then after all these disasters pass, then there's a gentle breeze that comes, right? And it's implied that Yahweh is somehow in the breeze, right? He's sort of omnipresent everywhere and above all these other gods that are just supposed to be, again, anthropomorphized versions of natural forces. He's supposed to be something greater. This notion of God being something greater, more abstract, was not just happening in Israel, interestingly. Right? All over the world, uh, there's what's called the axial age, where there are kind of leaps forward in religious thinking that were happening in different places at around the same time of a span of a few hundred years that sort of mirror each other. But as far as we know, there wasn't really any interaction among them. It just seems to be a development of human religious intellect or something that happened around this time. So we're going to get into that in the next lecture, and I'll see you then.